And we are happy to welcome into our studio Jordan Peterson, whom you all recognize, the clinical psychologist from the University of Toronto and Agenda Insight essayist, and his daughter, Mikhaila Peterson, who is a student at Concordia University. And you just turned how old?
20.
20. That's a big number now, isn't it?
It is.
Are you used to it yet?
No, I keep telling people I'm 19.
Well, we're really glad that both of you came in today. You we know a little better because you're on this station from time to time. You we need to get to know a little bit right now, okay? What do you remember from however long ago it was when you started to ask yourself, is there something wrong with my brain?
Well, there actually wasn't a time when I thought that there was something wrong. It pretty much seemed like it was everyone else. So there were times at night when I was scared. I was always worried someone was going to come into my house, kill everyone in my family, and just leave me by myself. I wasn't worried about anyone hurting me. It was mostly me being left alone. But I didn't think that was weird. That was just how it was.
How old were you when you were feeling that way?
Grade 2 to grade 6.
So 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, something like that?
Yeah.
Did you watch a lot of horror movies as a kid?
I didn't read horror movies. When I was a little bit, I didn't see horror movies. When I was a little bit older, I started reading Stephen King, but I don't think that actually made much of a difference to what I was thinking.
That had nothing to do with it?
I don't think so.
At what point did you think there's something else going on here?
Well, actually there was a point. When I was in grade 5, I'm not sure how old that is, 11 maybe, I started fighting with my friends, and I'd never fought with my friends before. I'd fought with my brother and my mom and my dad, which I figured was normal. But then there was one time we were playing volleyball when my friends did something I didn't like, and I went inside and I slammed the door, and I thought that may have been a bit of an overreaction. I didn't know it was wrong, I didn't know why I was so mad. So there was a point.
This, as we shall discover, is kind of the family curse in the Peterson family, isn't it? You have had depression yourself.
One of the family curses.
You've been dealing with depression yourself for much of your life, right? Since when did you?
That's hard to say. I mean, it might have been for my whole life, like as far back as I can remember. I know that when I was a child, I had a very low threshold for tears, abnormally low, and I wasn't the world's happiest adolescent. And you know, there's always reasons for that, but looking back, my mood was definitely more depressed than it should have been or could have been given my circumstances.
And at what point did you get a kind of a clinical diagnosis that you're not just a moody teen, you got something serious going on here?
Well, I don't know if I ever did get formally diagnosed by anyone other than me. You know, I started using a seasonal affective disorder light when I lived in Boston, which would have been in 1992. And that helped a lot. I'd use it from September till January. But there were times when I was in Boston, when I was lecturing, especially around January, where there were years when I wasn't sure I'd be able to do it. Because I lecture spontaneously, and when my mood goes down, I can go way out on an idea limb, but I have a hard time coming back. And it takes a lot of confidence to lecture spontaneously as well, and a lot of presence and a lot of energy, and all those things would go. And that wasn't so good. And then when I came to Toronto, it was reasonably well controlled with the light, but the year my daughter also developed arthritis, and the year she developed arthritis, we also bought a wreck of a house. So we bought it the day before she was diagnosed, and I spent 6 months running around trying to get Mikhaila sorted out and fixing up this house and not watching my light. And that Christmas, it was not good.
Not
I
good.
thought that it was unlikely that I would be able to go back and lecture. So that's when I first tried antidepressants. It was right around that time. That was about 10 years ago.
10 years ago.
Yeah.
As we suggested, this is a bit of a family thing for you guys, meaning it's not just your generation or your generation. Mm-hmm. Your father had this as well.
Yes, and it started to really seriously affect him. We lived in northern Alberta where it was very dark in the winters, and that's relevant because depression is often a seasonal disorder, and my father and I both have a pretty strong seasonal variant of this. And it was often the case that the dead of winter was a darker time in our household. Tempers were more frayed, and grudges were held longer. And although in many ways I had an excellent childhood, so it was complicated, you know. But that seemed to get worse every year. And then I moved away when I was 18, and things just continually got worse for my father, and he finally had to stop teaching when he was in his 40s. He was an elementary school teacher. And my dad was and is an extremely competent person. He was the fire chief in our small town, and he ran a number of community organizations, and you know, he was a respected and admired character. But when this came along, it was pretty. And
when he stopped teaching, what happened then? Did he work again?
No. He's done other things since then. I think for a while he thought it was teaching that was making him unhappy, because when you have depression, as Mikhaila pointed out, what you see, there's causes in the world, and depression is like a filter. Depression filters out good things and exaggerates bad things from a perceptual perspective, and so the way you experience it is that it's not something happening inside you, it's something that's happening in the world. And if you're irritated, and depressed people are often extremely irritated, especially at their family, then it's the other person. And it is in some ways the other person, because everyone does irritating things all the time. And maybe it's 1% irritating and 99% good, but if you're depressed, you'll react to the irritating bit. So my dad believed that it was teaching that was doing him in, but it wasn't. It was this depression. And I was in graduate school at that time, and I was starting to understand what depression was, clinical graduate school, and trying to understand that it had my father, and also that it had his father.
Did you, Mikhaila, know his dad well?
Yeah.
And were you in his presence at times when he was clearly depressed?
My grandpa's really, really good with little kids. So when I was little, when he was around me, there weren't really any times that he was depressed. There were times when I could hear my grandparents fighting, but I was little and I didn't really pay any attention. When I got older, I could tell, but when I was little, I couldn't tell.
Now again, as we suggested, your generation, your father, your grandfather.
Yeah.
Your grandfather's got a story with depression as well.
Yes, well, my grandfather was adopted, so we don't know anything about his biological family past that. But my grandfather, who was a powerful man, he was a blacksmith, and he was a strong guy. He was a musician, and he was a blacksmith, and he was a farmer in northern Alberta, and he lived in a log cabin out on the prairie and was a, you know, pioneer type of guy. He had forearms that were like this. He was a strong guy, built low, and he had his father, so that would have been his adoptive father, died when he was about 45, and they had farmed together and so forth, and that just did my grandfather in. And I mean, it's hard to explain the magnitude of that, but fundamentally for the next 30 years, he never walked more than half a block again in his life. He stayed on the couch.
He stayed at home.
Yes, and smoked far too much, and was dreadfully demolished and unhappy. And people thought, well, he'd given up, or you know, or they thought that maybe he was useless, you know. And it was that was pretty, and his house was pretty dark, and it was like, I can never remember him being anything but kind of broken, playful with me, you know. But I know my grandmother, it was very, very hard on my grandmother, and obviously extremely hard on my grandfather. But it was and it was doubly hard because, of course, we didn't know anything about what was wrong with him, because this is so long ago.
I was going to say, this is so long ago. You wouldn't have known that this was a clinical depression.
Well, and no one knew. Yeah. And so not only did he have to have the clinical depression, he had to have the judgment of his relative lack of utility to go along with it. And so, and that was hard on my dad, because of course seeing your father suffer it's a bit of a nightmare. And then of course it was hard on me to see my father like that, because he was the last person, really, he was the last person you would have ever thought something like this would have happened to.
But Mikhaila, as you see this family history unfold, you see a grandfather, I guess your great-grandfather, who was basically, I guess, incapacitated by his depression at a certain point, And now we look at you, who are university students, and by all accounts, doing great. There has been a progress over the years. Does that give you some satisfaction?
Yeah, I really don't know how I'm on antidepressants now, and I don't know how anybody in my family would have really survived without them.
How long have you been on them?
I've been on them for about 10 years. I went on them in the summer of grade 5, which seems early, but all the thoughts of, like at night, I never slept early. I always read, and then when I turned off my lights, or when I didn't turn off my lights, I had these terrible thoughts that I was gonna be left alone. And it wasn't just like a momentary thought, it had like a story. I was gonna be left alone, and then I didn't know where I was gonna live, and I didn't wanna leave all my friends. Like, it was a long story. But
so taking those medications means that you can do what, as opposed to when you were off them, you couldn't do what?
I smile a lot more, like I laugh a lot more, and I don't sleep as much as I would. I had a little bit of a low period in September this year, or probably from September to December this year, and I had a hard time going to school, and I slept a lot, and I didn't really want to do anything. And if I didn't have the antidepressants, I would be like that all the time.
But you were taking them even during this low period?
Yeah, but there was a bit of an upset. They found out one of the ones I'm on might have some bad side effects, so they lowered the maximum dosage, and so I had to switch, and that was annoying, to say the least.
That was annoying.
Yeah.
That's a good way to put it. Now, do you take anything for your depression?
Yeah,
You do.
I take 2. I have, like, the depression in our family happens to be extremely severe, and sometimes that requires the use of more than one medication. And so I take a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, which is
SSRI.
Yes, it's like Prozac. I don't take Prozac, but it's similar to that. And I also take a drug called Wellbutrin, and Wellbutrin, in many ways, is a safer drug, and its primary purpose is to increase positive emotion rather than decreasing negative emotion. Mm-hmm. And I did well on the serotonin reuptake inhibitor alone, but the addition of the Wellbutrin was definitely put in something that was missing. And
so what does it do for you, Jordan? Does it like kind of bevel the edges on the harsher
when
emotions?
I first started to take it, which is a momentous decision for people, you know, and especially for, I suppose, in some ways, someone like me, because of course I pride myself in some ways on having extremely tight control of my thoughts, for example. And even when I was very depressed, and I've been very depressed, I never had the cognitive portion of depression, which you think, if you're depressed cognitively, you think that the past was terrible and that the present is terrible and that the future is going to be even more terrible. And I knew I had a great life. I mean, I've always known I've had a great life. But it was hard to move, so it'd be like moving through molasses. That's annoying. That's called psychomotor slowing. And I have a lot of projects on the go, like the equivalent probably of 4 full-time jobs. And when I lose energy, like there's no way I can do that. That just goes. And that's real trouble, because if that goes for a couple of days, I'm in real trouble. When I took this antidepressant first, it was an indescribable relief. I mean, what happened was it kind of knocked me onto the couch for about 3 days. And I could feel muscles in my body relax that I know, I can still feel how it felt. It was such a relief. I could feel muscles in my body relax that probably hadn't relaxed for 15 years. And it was just, and to understand how that feels, and so that scares people sometimes if they take antidepressants, because they're afraid of the medication. And doing that to you is actually a good thing, because what's happening is your serotonin levels are going up, and when your serotonin levels go up, then your musculature can relax. You're not all tensed up and ready for the worst. And being like that for like 10 years is no joke. And so I thought, well, when I took the serotonin reuptake inhibitor, I thought, I will never stop taking this, ever.
And you have not?
No. No.
I have heard it described, Mikhaila, that by some friends of mine who've been battling depression, that they felt like they were walking around under a black cloud all day long, and that until they took their meds, the cloud was always there. Then they took the meds and the cloud kind of went away. Does that ring true for you?
Yeah, like Dad said, when I first started taking them, I slept probably for like, I don't know, 4 days. I just slept, and I can remember the feeling too. And I wasn't very old, I was like 11. And I can remember just like being able to breathe deeper. And yeah, thank God for those. But it is like walking around under a dark cloud. It's like when something terrible happens. So let's say your dog dies, and you feel the same way you do in the next week all the time. And even when good things happen in the next week, you still have the feeling that your dog died. But it's like that for everything. So even if it's your birthday, even if something great happens, you're like happy, but then you remember that your dog died. And it's like that for everything.
Does depression ever be, I had another friend of mine tell me this once, because depression was always there, it felt like a friend. And in a weird way, when he got, I don't think cured's the right word, but when it got controlled, it was an adjustment, because that friend that had been there for a long time, not a good friend, but a friend, suddenly disappeared. Does that ring true at all in your experience?
No.
You're happy to see the friend off.
Yeah, that was not a friend. That was someone who like
death.
punched me in the stomach and then just made sure it hurt all the time.
Depression, of course, comes in various degrees of severity. Where do you think you are right now?
Right now, I feel really good right now. I felt pretty bad earlier this year, but I had just moved away from home into a different city, and I had a roommate who I didn't get along with at all. So there were like kind of a number of factors. It was also, I felt it was pretty dark in Montreal. So my dad bought me one of those SAD lamps, seasonal affective disorder lamps.
Spiritually, you mean the weather?
I mean, like,
wasn't a lot of sunshine.
There wasn't a lot of sunshine,
Okay.
no. So, but that helped a little bit. But right now, I feel pretty good. If I didn't have the antidepressants, I know I would feel horrible. But I feel good now.
This is a bit off topic, but it does raise an interesting question. Given, how presumably difficult it was to find just the right mix of whatever it was, the right levels and so on, so that Mikhaila would be feeling good about the world. Why the decision to either send her or allow her to go to a different province where most of the people speak a different language, far away from home? That's an unusual choice, some would say.
Well, we've always encouraged our kids to be very independent. And so, for example, I used to send them in the summer to see their grandparents on the plane, and they did that ever since they were 7 years old. And Mikhaila and my son Julian are very independent people. And that's what they wanted to do and what they'd been encouraged to do. Now, the complication for us and for Mikhaila was that her health problems, because she also has rheumatoid arthritis, her health problems are so complex that it's difficult for her to manage them on her own without having someone kind of watch her. And it has nothing to do with her lack of ability. It's just that some things are so complex that... But as a clinician, I mean, I've seen far more people damaged by overprotection than by underprotection.
Right.
So, and it's been really good for her, I believe. Yeah.
Yes? It has been good.
Yeah.
Get away from home.
Well, at first I was encouraged to do what I wanted, but I was also encouraged to stay closer to home, because it is hard to, I think it's hard to, sometimes it's hard to notice that something's wrong. Especially when you get depressed, your mood kind of slowly gets worse, and then it's not you're in a bad mood, it's everyone's really annoying. So I was encouraged to stay closer to home, but I wasn't discouraged from moving. And I was born in Montreal, so I always kind of felt like that was home. So I was gonna move back to Toronto next year in January. I was 100% sure, but I switched roommates and
Things got better.
things got a lot better, yeah.
Can I ask you a completely inappropriate question?
I think so.
Most kids, I'm going to say, most kids your age who go away to university are dating and have a pretty heavy social life and all that kind of thing. At what point in the conversation with a prospective, and I don't even know if you have a boyfriend, but at what point in the conversation with a prospective paramour, let's put it that way, do you put this issue on the table and say, incidentally, you probably should know this about me?
Well, when I was little, when I was in grade 2 and I found out I had arthritis, I didn't want anyone to know. And my brother was younger, he was in grade 1, and he sometimes told people, and I didn't like that at all. Like, I'd get really mad. And then in grade 7, for some reason, it just stopped bothering me. And I was like, if you make it into, it's a big deal, but if you make it into something horrible, people are gonna treat you like it's horrible. So I moved into my new roommate's room, and I think within the first 4 hours, I told them I had like severe depression, and that freaked them out. I found out later that really freaked them out, but once they got to know me, yeah, I didn't notice it freaked them out, but once they got to know me, they told me, and they're like, it freaked us out, but like, we don't care, because people don't usually care. Usually I tell people, I talk a lot in general, and I think I just talk about everything, so I don't hide that from people at all. I used to, but I don't anymore. And
is that something you'll drop on a first date?
Before the first date.
Before the first date, okay.
I don't know if that's, I don't know. I talk a lot, like I said, so it doesn't bother me.
I think at some point it's got to come up, right?
She told me the other day, I'm Mikhaila. I have lots of diseases, so you better run away now.
Well, that raises a good question. Do you ever stop and think to yourself, my goodness, in the lottery of life, I sure was born behind the 8 ball?
No. I don't, because there are a lot of, you know how Dad said that he was on Wellbutrin for more positive emotion? Mm-hmm. I don't think I have a problem with positive emotion. I think I have a lot of negative emotion, and that's outweighs positive emotion, but I'm definitely not lacking in positive emotion. So when I think I have arthritis, I have like depression, and that makes everything a lot harder and some things impossible, there are also a lot of things I'm really happy about. Like, I have a pretty easy time in school. Because of my arthritis, I didn't run around as much as normal kids, so I read a lot, and I think that helped with, yeah, exactly. So I didn't think that was, it's a horrible thing, but not every horrible thing, but a lot of horrible things come with positive as well. Once you're on antidepressants, you can see that. Right. When you're not, you don't think like that.
Now, have you ever, Jordan Peterson, been to a psychiatrist to have yourself examined?
I went and saw a psychoanalyst once when I was in graduate school, but it was for reasons that weren't really related to this depression. I mean, wouldn't say I was depressed when I was in graduate school. Now and then, probably. But apart from that, no. And
do you see the irony of a guy who makes his life as a clinical psychologist basically avoiding most of the psychiatric profession to deal with what everybody acknowledges is a thing?
I have a good family doctor. He's been very helpful, and he's been very helpful for Mikhaila too. And I know a lot as a clinician about depression, and I can see what is wrong with me and what isn't. But more importantly, the antidepressants, they work. They work, I would say for me, apart from the odd side effect, they work basically perfectly, and thank God for that. Mikhaila told me once, you know, she's had 2 joints replaced, by the way, because of her arthritis, but she told me once that if she had to get rid of one illness only, it would be the depression.
Not the arthritis.
Right, and that's worth thinking about.
That
because,
is really worth thinking about.
Yeah, and that's a good indication of how awful depression is. Like, and she talked about it in relationship to grief, and I've grieved for people and things, but when you grieve and you're not depressed, you have your life and there's a hole in it. And when you're depressed, you do everything, and underneath that, there's a gigantic hole. And grieving, terrible as it is, it's part of life, but depression is part of death. It's an ice cold blackness.
Well, then let me ask this is a controversial follow-up, I think. Someday, we're going to be able, through DNA testing or whatever, to presumably figure out whether or not people have a genetic predisposition towards depression? And if it is death, should we do something about that?
Well, it's complicated because negative emotion itself is extremely useful. I mean, people who don't have negative emotion become incredibly impulsive, and they're unable to operate in the world. This happens sometimes to people who have damage to their right prefrontal cortex. They become inappropriately happy, and they tend to make incredibly impulsive, terrible decisions. And so you need negative emotion, and how much of it you need isn't clear. Now, but if it goes too far, it starts to spiral in on itself, and then it eats everything. And so in order to control it in the way you're suggesting, we're going to have to understand it incredibly well. And I would say from a molecular perspective, we're a long ways from that.
So it's not on for the next number of decades.
No, and you know, all the genetic work that's been done on the predisposition to illnesses have revealed mostly how complicated it is and how many different forms the genetic predisposition can take, and how often it's specific to a family. And like, it's the idea that a gene would code for a complex disease turns out to be really, really wrong, unfortunately. So,
two last couple of quick questions for you. Number one, no one wants to be depressed, obviously. No one wants depression. But if you have to have it, are you glad that he's your father, given his own experience with it? He knows a lot about it.
Well, if my dad hadn't had it, there's no way anyone would have known when I was in grade 5. And I was really sad. I wasn't even really sad. I was really angry when I was little. And I fought with my brother a lot, and as soon as I started taking antidepressants, I felt really bad about that, because there were things that he would do accidentally, and I would get so mad, and I wouldn't be able to forgive him, and I'd be really mean. And at the time, it was completely justifiable, but looking back on it, it was just mean. And it was completely unfair for both sides, because my brother hadn't done anything wrong, but to me, in my head, he had. So if someone had done something that made me feel that way, the way I had reacted would be appropriate, but he didn't deserve it.
Last question. Mikhaila is an unusual name. It's not completely unique, but it's unusual. Who are you named after?
Mikhail Gorbachev.
You are named after a former Soviet leader.
Yes.
Do you know why he did that for you or to you?
Do I know why my dad did that to me?
Yes.
He didn't completely ruin the world.
Your dad or Gorbachev? I assume you mean Gorbachev.
Yeah.
That's, I don't know anybody else in the world who's been named after Mikhail Gorbachev. But
yeah, well, well, I don't know what to say about it. Mikhaila's had to put up with a lot of strangeness, I suppose, in one way or another.
So why not add that to it?
Well, that's just how it is, I guess, for her.
In the Peterson household.
Yeah, she's sort of stuck with that. Yeah.
I can't thank you two enough for doing this. We've had a lot of courageous people come on our TV channel in the last little while and talk about their lives, and we are happy to include you in that mix of very courageous people who are helping let the sunshine in.
Yeah.
Thanks,
well,
guys.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.